Hi everyone, I'm back to read chapter 4 called Singing Bird and Yellow Hair. And that is chapter 4 in our book, Kirsten Learns a Lesson. Singing Bird and Yellow Hair. Miss Winston stopped next to Kirsten's seat and tapped the back of the log bench with her ruler. I don't believe you're really trying, the teacher scolded. Why can't you learn your poem? Kirsten bit her lip. I am trying, ma'am, she said. Please look at me when I speak to you, Miss Winston said. Kirsten forced herself to look up. She thought that if Miss Winston didn't look so stern, she would be very pretty. Can you read the words of your poem? Miss Winston asked. She pointed to the lines which Kirsten had been trying all week to memorize. I can read the words, but I can't remember them, Kirsten murmured. Your cousin Lisbeth recited all 32 lines of To a Waterfowl. I'm only asking you to memorize a few lines. Your memory is like a muscle, Kirsten. You must use it to make it strong. Kirsten nodded unhappily. Her poor mind felt like a tired muscle. When she tried to say her poem without looking at the book, the words seemed to disappear like geese flying into the mist. It seemed everyone could memorize and recite except Kirsten. Amos Anderson had learned a whole poem. He recited it with his voice galloping along like the horses and the battle he described. Miss Winston had smiled proudly when she handed him a reward of merit. Kirsten thought that Miss Winston was proud of everyone but her. You must try harder, Miss Winston said firmly. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Memorize her... Kirsten thought that even if she could memorize her poem, she was sure to forget it when she stood up in front of the class. If she forgot, she might cry, and that would be the worst thing of all. The next morning, Kirsten got up extra early and rushed through her chores. Why are you in such a hurry? Mama asked. She put out several thin pancakes and a slice of ham for Kirsten's breakfast. Kirsten wrapped the ham in a pancake. I'll eat it on the way to school. I'm going early to practice saying my verse. You've learned a verse in English? Oh, you're a smart girl, Kirsten, Mama said with a big smile. Go on then, if you're doing schoolwork, Papa said. Kirsten ran for the door. Tell Elizabeth and Anna I'm practicing. I'll meet them at school, she said. She knew it was wrong to lie to Mama and Papa, but she couldn't help herself. As she ran to meet Singing Bird, she tried to say her poem so the lie wouldn't be such a bad one. As soon as she heard Singing Bird whistle, Kirsten forgot all about the poem and her lie. She handed Singing Bird the pancake and the meat, and the girl ate gladly. Then Singing Bird said, Come. Kirsten ran behind Singing Bird through the long, pale prairie grass. Crows flew up beside them and rabbits scattered. Kirsten didn't even care how far they had to run. She was glad to be free from school, glad to be on this adventure with Singing Bird. They ran through a grove of pines, went up the trail to the top of the hill. Down below, five big Indian teepees circled a large campfire. Nearby, a spotted pony grazed. As the girls started down the hill to the village, scrawny Indian dogs ran barking to meet them. Then Indian children came from the tents. They spoke to Singing Bird in their language. The children crowded around and wanted to touch Kirsten's blonde hair. One little boy crouched to touch her leather boots and their laces. Indian women came forward to look at Kirsten's apron too. Their dark hands were gentle. Singing Bird stood close to Kirsten's side. Then she said, Come to my father, and pointed to the tallest teepee. Kirsten followed Singing Bird to the teepee. It was made of buffalo skins. Singing Bird lifted the flap. That was its door. Inside the teepee was dim and warm. When Kirsten's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw a man sitting cross-legged on a bearskin. Eagle feathers were braided into his hair, and he wore a necklace of bear claws. I am Brave Elk, he said in a deep voice. How do you do? Kirsten said, and remembered to curtsy. You are Singing Bird's friend? He said. Yes, Kirsten said, and she touched Singing Bird's arm to make sure she was by her side. Singing Bird is my friend too. You teach your English words to Singing Bird? Brave Elk said. My English words? That surprised Kirsten, but she thought Brave Elk was right. She hadn't thought once of trying to speak Swedish with Singing Bird. Singing Bird teaches me too, Kirsten went on. Teepee, moccasin. And she pointed at those things to show Brave Elk that she knew what she said in his language. The chief nodded. Good. You are Yellow Hair. You are welcome here. You stay, he said. He motioned to the woman who stood in the shadows. The woman gave Kirsten a piece of flat bread made from cornmeal. Now, Singing Bird led Kirsten to sit beside her on a pile of animal skins. She showed Kirsten her leather pouch, which held a knife, a bone needle, and a length of sinew for sewing. She showed Kirsten her doll, which was made of soft buckskin and is stuffed with grass. Oh, how Kirsten wished that she could live here in this warm tent with Singing Bird. She would wear soft moccasins like Singing Bird's. She would wear a deerskin dress and leggings. She would sleep under warm buffalo hides and play with a little buckskin doll of her own. All day she and Singing Bird would play in the fields and woods. Instead, Kirsten Larson, who couldn't memorize her poem, she would be Yellow Hair, Singing Bird's sister. A little boy came into the teepee to show Kirsten his wooden top. When he lifted the tent flap, Kirsten saw that the sun had risen high in the sky. She would have to run fast in order to get to school on time. She touched Singing Bird's arm and pointed to the sun. The girl said something to her father, then held open the tent flap. Come, she said to Kirsten, and they ran back up the trail. Okay, chapter 5 is called Belonging. It was Sunday night, and Miss Winston sat next to Uncle Olaf at the table. It was her first meal with the Larsons. Aunt Inger and Mama had made a big dinner to welcome her. They'd even baked ginger cookies just like at Christmas. My parents have a lovely home on a harbor in Maine, Miss Winston said. There's a small room on the top. It has windows on all 4 sides, and when my father is at sea, we watch for his ship from that room. What a fine room that must be, Anna said. She was the only one talking to Miss Winston. Uncle Olaf offered everyone more rabbit stew. Mama kept busy cutting and passing bread. Why did you want to leave such a lovely home? Anna asked. She was so excited to have Miss Winston there that she'd forgotten all about her supper. Well, I certainly wasn't ready to marry and spend the rest of my life in a house, Miss Winston said. I wanted to travel, to meet people, to have adventures. School teachers travel, so I decided to become a teacher. Maybe you will be a teacher when you grow up, Anna. You've been a good little teacher for Kirsten. Kirsten kept her eyes on her tin plate, and with Miss Winston at the table, it seemed she had forgotten all the English she'd ever learned. And what if Mama and Papa said something to Miss Winston about the poem Kirsten said she had memorized? Miss Winston would say Kirsten hadn't done it. Kirsten's head ached at the thought. Anna said, Does your father sail on his ship every day? Miss Winston smiled. No, Anna, he isn't a fisherman. He has a big ship for carrying heavy cargo. He sails down the coast with a load of wool. Then he sails back with a load of tobacco. I might want to be a sailor, Lars said. Life is exciting on a ship. Miss Winston looked at Lars. Would you like to see my father's ship? Ja, Lars said. Then he reddened and corrected himself. Yes, ma'am. Then after our meal, I'll show you a surprise, Miss Winston said. Eat, Anna, Uncle Olaf commanded. You'll get thin if you don't pay attention to your dinner. After everyone had finished eating, Miss Winston left the table. She climbed the ladder to the loft where she'd put her things. In a moment, she was back with a bottle in her hand. She set the bottle on the side in the middle of the table. Everyone leaned forward to look. Inside the bottle was a model of a 2 schooner. This ship looks just like my father's, said Miss Winston. Kirsten drew in the sharp breath. It looks just like the Eagle, too, she said. Miss Winston handed Kirsten the bottle so that she could get a better look. Now she saw the ship closely. The ship we sailed on to America looked just like this one. It was called the Eagle. We sailed for 10 weeks. There were terrible storms and everyone was sick. 6 people died on the ship, and the sailor buried them at sea. She stopped, breathless, surprised at how many words that she had just blurted out in English. Miss Winston pressed her forefinger to her lips and looked closely at Kirsten. You remember the ship clearly, don't you? Oh, yes, my friend Marta and I played on the deck, Miss Kirsten said. Ah, Miss Kirsten exclaimed. You've given me an idea, Kirsten. In school the next day, Miss Winston came to Kirsten's side right after the first song. She handed Kirsten a piece of paper. Kirsten sat up straight, her heart thudding. Miss Winston never gave out paper. Here is another poem for you, Kirsten. I want you to memorize it instead of the first one I gave you, Miss Winston said. It's 4 lines from a long poem about a man who was a sailor all his life. When you spoke of your trip on the Eagle, I thought you might like those lines. Can you read them? Miss Winston's writing was as perfect as the writing in a book. Kirsten held the paper in both hands and read slowly and clearly. Swiftly, swiftly flew the ship, yet she sailed softly too. Sweetly, sweetly blew the breeze, on me alone it blew. As she read, Kirsten could almost feel the ocean wind on her face and taste the salt spray on her lips. And she missed Marta. You read that well, Kirsten. Do you think you could memorize these lines? Miss Winston asked. Kirsten nodded. She hoped that if she forgot any words, she could imagine the Eagle and the words would come back to her. I'll try, she said. Miss Winston bent down until her eyes were level with Kirsten's. You will try and you will succeed. Remember that, please. Then she went to open the door to the iron stove so that Amos could put in more wood to heat the classroom. Because Kirsten and her family ate dinner at Uncle Olaf's house now, it was impossible for Kirsten to meet Singing Bird at their usual time in the evening, and there was never enough time in the morning. But on Wednesday, Kirsten managed to leave a tiny doll made of yarn for her friend. After school, she found a piece of blue and white beadwork in its place. She thought it would make a beautiful headband for Sorry. Beside the beads, Singing Bird had drawn a full sun in the sand. She wanted Kirsten to come early in the morning to meet her. Sadly, Kirsten drew a cross through the drawing to tell Singing Bird that she couldn't come. When would she be able to meet her friend again? On Friday, Kirsten whispered to Miss Winston that she was ready to recite her verse. Her chest ached and her stomach fluttered, but she wanted to recite before she forgot the poem. Miss Winston held up her hand and told everyone to be still. Kirsten Larson will now recite. Please come forward, Kirsten. Miss Winston stepped back so that Kirsten could stand in front of the stove where everyone would see her. Slowly, Kirsten walked to the center of the room. She tried to keep her chin high, just like Miss Winston did. She saw Anna's smile and Lars grin. Then the room seemed to blur and fade, and all she heard was the thud of her heart. You may recite now, Miss Winston said. With feeling, please. Now, Kirsten told herself. She imagined the sails of the Eagle creaking overhead. She imagined seagulls swooping and diving in the wind. She imagined Marta sitting by her side on the deck. Swiftly, swiftly flew the ship, Kirsten said. She heard her own words clearly, as though someone else had spoken them. She kept her eyes closed and recited the poem without a single mistake. When she opened her eyes, the other students were smiling at her. Miss Winston touched her shoulder. You recited very well, Kirsten. You recited with feeling. I'm proud of you, she said. Kirsten sat down in a daze. She had stood in front of everyone and recited her poem in English. She hadn't thought she could do it, but she had, and it hadn't been so hard after all. The next time would be easier. She was sure of it. She'd been scared, but she had done it, and now Miss Winston was proud of her. Anna nudged her and said, "Good for you," and Elizabeth gave her a wink that said the same thing. "Now it's time for reading," Miss Winston said, but Kirsten was too dizzy to read. "May I fetch the water for our drink?" she asked Miss Winston. "Yes, Kirsten, thank you. As you walk, don't forget to take deep breaths to draw in fresh air into your lungs," Miss Winston said with a smile. Kirsten seized the bucket and her shawl. Outside, the air was cold. A light dusting of snow lay on the ground, and when she reached the stream, Kirsten found a thin coat of ice on the water. She broke the ice easily with a stick and dipped her bucket into the stream. As she did, she heard a whistle from a meadowlark. When Kirsten looked up, she saw Singing Bird standing among the ice-coated cattails on the other side of the stream. "Hello," Kirsten said. "Come," Singing Bird answered. "But I can't come with you now," Kirsten said. "I have to go back to school." "Come," Singing Bird repeated. She crossed the stream on a fallen log. "Maybe I can come after school," Kirsten said, though she wasn't sure how she could. "Come now," Singing Bird replied. "We go today." Kirsten grasped her friend's cold hand. "Go? You're going? But why?" "No food," Singing Bird said. She pressed her hands to her stomach. "Don't you have enough food?" Kirsten asked. She remembered the terrible pains in her stomach when Papa's crops had failed in Sweden. She remembered how Peter had cried when there was no more bread to eat. "Bad hunting," Singing Bird explained. She held up her arms as though she shot an arrow from a bow. "We go to find food." Kirsten remembered that Lisbeth and Anna had told her the wild animals were leaving the land because the settlers were building farms. The Indians didn't have enough food to eat. They were leaving to find more food. "Where will you go?" Kirsten asked. When Papa couldn't grow enough food in Sweden, they had come here to America. Where could the Indians go to find better hunting? Singing Bird pointed west. "We go there for buffalo, for deer." Then she stroked the blonde braids, which looped Kirsten's ears. "You come too," Singing Bird said. Kirsten looked at the snow-covered hill, where a hawk circled in the sky. Then she looked at her friend's dark face so close to her own. "Come, sister," Singing Bird said. She took Kirsten's hand. Kirsten remembered the warm teepee where Singing Bird lived. She imagined herself sleeping by Singing Bird's side under the buffalo hides. If she lived with Singing Bird, she would be free to roam the woods all day. Brave Elk would be good to her. He was the chief, and Kirsten would be his yellow-haired daughter. She and Singing Bird would always be together. But how could Kirsten leave her own parents, her brothers, her cousins? How could she leave the cabin under the pines? If she didn't come back home, Mama and Papa would be wild with worry. They would think she was lost. They might even think that she had been killed. And they would never give her permission to go with Singing Bird. "No, I can't come with you," Kirsten said. "I want to come, but this is my home. I can't leave my home," Kirsten said. Singing Bird looked down sadly. She reached into her pouch she wore around her waist and took out her bone needle. She gave it to Kirsten. Kirsten closed her hand around the bone needle. "Will you come back, Singing Bird?" Singing Bird shook her head. "If deer come back," she said. "Oh, please do come back," Kirsten said. "I'll be here, right here. You can find me easily. Whistle for me by the stream." "If deer come back," Singing Bird repeated. She touched Kirsten's braid one last time. Then she ran back to the fallen log and crossed the stream. She waved at the edge of the pine forest before she disappeared into the snow-covered trees. Kirsten watched her friend go. She imagined Singing Bird's tribe, hungry, wandering, looking for food. Where would they go? How far would they have to travel before they could set up their village again? Now Kirsten understood that if the settlers made a home here, The Indians would have to find a new home. She filled her water bucket and trudged slowly back to the school. She pushed open the door to the warm room. Miss Winston looked up from her place by the stove. "You've been gone a long time, Kirsten. I thought you'd found that ship in your poem and sailed back to Sweden." "No, ma'am," Kirsten said softly. She knew it was a joke, but she was too sad to smile. She slipped her hand into her pocket and touched the bone needle. How she would miss Singing Bird. Miss Winston smiled, though. "I left something for you. It's in your reader," she said. Kirsten looked around the cozy room crowded with busy children. She wasn't sure when this place had become her own, but she belonged here now. Her reader lay on the bench waiting for her. "Will you help me again?" she asked Anna. "Yes," Anna said gladly, as she always did, and she made room on the bench, and Kirsten sat down and opened her book. All right, and that is the end of our book, Kirsten Learns a Lesson, and next time I'll read Looking Back, A Peek into the Past.